There is a spear tip sitting in a museum in South Africa. It was found in a cave called Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of the continent, buried in sediment that has been dated with careful precision to approximately 500,000 years ago. It is made of stone, shaped by human hands into a point sharp enough to penetrate flesh, hafted onto a wooden shaft with a sophistication that required planning and knowledge, and the ability to imagine a finished object before it existed. 500,000 years old. The person who made it is so far removed from us in time that the distance is essentially meaningless as a human concept. 500,000 years ago, our species did not yet fully exist in the form we recognize today. The being that shaped that spear tip was something between what came before and what we became, standing at a threshold that it could not see and did not know it was standing at. And it was making weapons. This is the first thing to understand about the history of weapons. It does not begin with civilization. It does not begin with armies or kingdoms or the organized violence of states. It begins before all of that, in the deep prehistory of our species, at a moment so early that the beings making the first weapons were still in the process of becoming human. The weapon is not a product of civilization. The weapon made civilization possible. Think about what a weapon actually is. A tool for extending the reach and multiplying the force of a human body. A way of doing more damage from a safer distance than bare hands allow. A way of killing something larger and stronger than you are, or killing something at a distance before it can close with you, or killing something without the risk of being killed yourself in the process. Every advance in weapon technology across 500,000 years of human history has been a variation on these same three imperatives: reach, force, safety. The spear gave reach. The bow multiplied force and added distance. The fortification gave safety. The gun combined all three in a single handheld object that a person of ordinary physical strength could use to kill another person of extraordinary physical strength from a distance of several hundred meters without any personal risk beyond being shot back at. The gun democratized killing, and every technology that came after the gun, the artillery shell and the bomb and the missile and the drone, has continued the same trajectory. More reach, more force, more safety for the person wielding the weapon, until we arrive at the present moment, where a person sitting in an air-conditioned room in Nevada can pilot a drone over Afghanistan and kill a specific individual identified by facial recognition software, and then drive home for dinner. The distance between the person pulling the trigger and the person dying has increased from the length of an arm to the circumference of the earth. This is the story that the history of weapons tells. A story about the human relationship with violence, about the ingenuity applied to the problem of killing across 500,000 years, about the way weapon technology has shaped civilizations and destroyed them, and created the world we live in today. It is also a story about something that most histories of weapons leave out: the people who made them. Not the kings who ordered them, or the generals who deployed them, or the politicians who authorized their use. The people who actually sat down and thought about how to make a thing that killed more effectively than the thing that existed before. The engineers and the metallurgists and the chemists and the physicists who applied their best intelligence to the oldest problem in human history. How do you kill something before it kills you? The answers they found changed everything. Every political boundary on the map of the world today was drawn, ultimately, by weapons. Every empire that ever existed was built with them and destroyed by them. Every revolution, every liberation, every atrocity, every act of defense and every act of aggression in the entire recorded history of human civilization was shaped by what weapons were available, who had them, and what they could do. The spear tip in the South African Museum is the beginning of a line that runs through the bronze sword and the iron lance and the longbow and the cannon and the rifle and the machine gun and the atomic bomb, to the drone circling silently over a city you have never heard of at this exact moment. It is an unbroken line. It has never stopped moving forward, and the next point on that line is already being built. In a laboratory somewhere, by someone applying their best intelligence to the oldest problem our species has ever faced. This is where it starts. 500,000 years ago, with a point made of stone, and a hand that knew exactly what it was for. The first weapon was not made. It was picked up. A rock, a branch, an animal bone lying on the ground. The first act of weaponry in human history was not a feat of engineering, but a feat of imagination. The moment when one of our ancestors looked at an object lying on the ground and understood that it could be used as an extension of the body. That the force of an arm swing multiplied by the weight and hardness of a stone was something qualitatively different from the force of an arm swing alone. We cannot date this moment. It is too old and too simple to leave the kind of archaeological evidence that can be precisely analyzed. What we can date is the moment when the rocks stopped being picked up and started being shaped. When the random stone became the deliberate tool. When the act of making a weapon became something that required planning and skill and the transmission of knowledge from one person to another. The Oldowan tools, the earliest shaped stone tools in the archaeological record, date to approximately 2.5 million years ago. They were made not by Homo sapiens, but by our ancestors, Homo habilis and related species, in the Olduvai Gorge in what is now Tanzania. Simple flakes struck from a core stone at an angle that produces a sharp edge, requiring an understanding of how stone fractures and the manual dexterity to strike at precisely the right point with precisely the right force. 2.5 million years ago. For perspective, our species, Homo sapiens, has existed for approximately 300,000 years. The tradition of making sharp-edged stone tools is 8 times older than our species. It predates us by so large a margin that it is almost impossible to think of it as human behavior. And yet, it is the behavior from which everything else follows, the first step on a line that leads, with remorseless logic, to everything that came after. The shaped stone was a cutting tool before it was a weapon. Used to butcher animals, to scrape hides, to process plant materials. The distinction between a tool and a weapon is, in the early archaeological record, largely meaningless, because the same object served both purposes, and the purpose in any given moment depended on what was in front of the person holding it. This ambiguity is important. It runs through the entire history of weapons. The knife that cuts bread also cuts throats. The chemistry that produces fertilizer also produces explosives. The physics that generates nuclear power also generates nuclear bombs. The history of weapons is inseparable from the history of tools, because they are, at the most fundamental level, the same thing. The application of human ingenuity to the problem of controlling the physical world, with violence as one possible application among many. The spear was the first dedicated weapon, the first object made specifically and primarily for killing, rather than for the broader range of tasks that a cutting tool serves. The earliest wooden spears in the archaeological record, found at a site called Schöningen in Germany, date to approximately 300,000 years ago. They are remarkable objects, made from the straightest part of spruce trees, tapered at both ends, with the hardest and heaviest part of the wood at the front for balance and penetrating power. 300,000-year-old spears, already optimized, already reflecting an understanding of ballistics and materials and the mechanics of penetration that is, given the cognitive resources available to the beings who made them, extraordinary. The spear changed everything about the human relationship with other animals. A human being with a spear is a different creature from a human being without one. Without a spear, a human is a medium-sized primate with no particular physical advantages over the large predators of the African savanna. Slower than a lion, weaker than a leopard. Without the teeth or claws that make large carnivores dangerous. A prey animal as much as a predator. Perpetually vulnerable to the things that were faster and stronger. With a spear, a human being can kill a lion from a distance, can kill a mammoth if enough spear-carrying humans work together, can kill anything that walks or runs or swims, given sufficient skill and sufficient numbers. The spear did not just make humans better hunters, it reorganized the entire relationship between our species and the rest of the animal world. It is one of the reasons, perhaps the primary reason, that the megafauna of every continent that humans colonized went extinct shortly after human arrival. The giant mammals of North America, the mammoths and the mastodons, and the giant ground sloths and the American horses, disappeared within a few thousand years of the first humans crossing the land bridge from Asia. The megafauna of Australia went extinct shortly after the first humans arrived there. The pattern repeats everywhere, because the pattern has a single cause. Humans with spears arrived. The animals had no defense against a predator that could kill from a distance, that could coordinate with other predators, that could plan an attack over days and across miles. Evolution had not prepared them for this. Nothing in the history of life on Earth had prepared them for this. The spear was a discontinuity, a break in the normal rules of predator and prey, and the animals that encountered it for the first time had no behavioral or physical adaptation that could save them. We hunted them to extinction, with sticks and stones. The bow and arrow arrived later, somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 years ago, depending on which archaeological evidence you find most convincing, and it completed the transformation that the spear had begun. Where the spear required the hunter to be close enough to throw, within perhaps 30 or 40 meters for an accurate cast, the bow extended effective killing range to 100 meters or more. It required less physical strength to use than a throwing spear. It allowed for greater accuracy, and it could be reloaded and fired multiple times in the time it took to retrieve and throw a single spear. The bow was a revolution in weapons technology, as significant as any that came later. It was the first ranged weapon in the full sense, the first tool that allowed a human being to kill from a distance at which the target could not effectively retaliate. It gave the person holding it something that every subsequent advance in weapons technology has been trying to maximize ever since: asymmetric advantage. The ability to kill without being killed in return. This is the fundamental logic of all weapons development. Not just to kill, but to kill safely. Not just to have force, but to have force that the other side cannot match. The spear gave humans an advantage over animals. The bow gave humans with bows an advantage over humans without them. And when one group of humans has an asymmetric advantage over another group, the consequences follow with a logic that has been consistent across every culture and every era in human history. The group with the better weapons wins. Not always immediately, not always cleanly. History is full of cases where courage, or terrain, or numbers, or disease, or luck overrode a technological disadvantage. But over time, consistently, across the entire span of human history, the group with the better weapons wins. This is why every human society has always invested in weapons technology. Not because humans are uniquely violent or uniquely militaristic, though some are more than others. Because the alternative, falling behind in weapons technology, has consequences that are too catastrophic to accept. The group that stops innovating its weapons eventually encounters a group that did not stop, and the encounter goes badly. The Stone Age did not end because humans ran out of stone. It ended because someone discovered that certain rocks, when heated to high enough temperatures, produced something harder and sharper and more durable than any stone. They called it metal, and the world changed again. Bronze did not arrive like a discovery. It arrived like a secret. Somewhere in the Middle East, approximately 5,000 years ago, a metal worker heating copper ore in a furnace noticed that when certain other rocks were present in the mix. The metal that came out was different, harder, more durable, more resistant to the deformation that made pure copper weapons bend and blunt after heavy use. The other rocks contained tin. The alloy produced by combining copper and tin in roughly the right proportions was bronze. And bronze was not just better than copper in the way that a sharper stone is better than a duller one. It was better in a way that changed the fundamental nature of what a weapon could be. Stone has limits that no amount of skill can overcome. It fractures. It cannot be reshaped once broken. The forms it can take are constrained by the natural geometry of how rock cleaves, by the angles at which flint and obsidian and chert break when struck. A stone tool is always a negotiation between what the maker wants and what the stone allows. Metal has no such constraints. Metal is liquid before it is solid. You pour it into a mold, and it becomes exactly the shape of the mold. Any shape you can imagine and construct. A sword blade with a complex cross-section designed to maximize strength and minimize weight. A spear tip with a socket that fits precisely onto a standard shaft diameter. An arrowhead with barbs that make it impossible to remove from a wound without causing more damage than the initial penetration. All of these required not just the discovery of metal, but the understanding that metal could be designed, that the properties of the finished weapon could be engineered into it at the moment of manufacture. This was a conceptual revolution as much as a technical one. The bronze sword was the first weapon that was genuinely designed, thought through, optimized for a specific purpose by people who understood the mechanics of what they were creating. The long, thin blade that could thrust between armor plates. The heavier, chopping blade optimized for slashing through unarmored opponents. The leaf-shaped blade that combined the thrusting capability of a narrow point with the slashing capability of wide edges. Each of these was an engineering decision made by someone who understood what the weapon needed to do and knew how to make the metal do it. Bronze weapons gave their possessors an advantage so decisive that the societies which had them and the societies which did not were not really in military competition at all. A bronze sword against a stone axe is not a fair fight. It is an execution. The metal blade holds its edge through repeated impacts that would shatter stone. It can be resharpened when it dulls. It can be repaired when damaged. It can be made longer and thinner than any stone blade, giving its user a reach advantage that compounds the material advantage. The first armies, in the proper sense of the word, were bronze armies. Sumer, in what is now southern Iraq, developed the first recognizable military formations around 2500 BCE, equipped with bronze weapons and protected by bronze helmets and copper shields. The Standard of Ur, a remarkable artifact found in a royal tomb and dating to approximately this period, shows these early soldiers in formation, equipped with spears and axes and helmets, moving together in a way that is already recognizable as something beyond a mob, a disciplined force, an army. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley Civilization, the early Chinese states. All of them developed bronze weapons at roughly similar periods, and all of them developed, alongside the weapons, the social and political structures necessary to deploy those weapons effectively. Armies require supply chains. Supply chains require administration. Administration requires writing and accounting and the whole apparatus of bureaucratic organization that appears in the archaeological record at roughly the same time as bronze weapons. The sword and the bureaucracy arrived together. This is not a coincidence. An army is not just a collection of armed men. It is a logistical system, a political institution, a social organization of enormous complexity that requires the kind of administrative infrastructure that only appears in societies that have already developed significant complexity in other areas. Bronze weapons did not create civilization, but they created a pressure toward larger and more organized political units, because a larger and more organized political unit could field a larger and more disciplined army, and a larger and more disciplined army beat a smaller and less disciplined one. Size and organization became survival strategies. The city-state that could not field an army large enough to defend itself was absorbed by one that could. The kingdom that could not maintain the supply chains necessary to keep its army fed and equipped in the field lost to one that could. The empire that could project military force at a distance dominated the peoples that could not resist it. The Bronze Age was an age of empires, precisely because bronze weapons made large-scale organized violence both possible and necessary. And then, around 1200 BCE, something happened that the historians call the Bronze Age collapse, one of the most mysterious catastrophes in ancient history. Within a period of roughly 50 years, almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously collapsed. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Ugaritic civilization of the Syrian coast. Egypt survived, but was permanently weakened. The palace economies of the Bronze Age, with their complex administrative systems and their long-distance trade networks and their bronze-equipped armies, simply ceased to exist. The causes are still debated. Climate change, drought, earthquakes, internal rebellions, the disruptions caused by the mysterious sea peoples who appear in Egyptian records as invaders from somewhere in the Mediterranean. Probably all of these together, a cascade of interconnected failures that brought down systems too complex and too interdependent to absorb multiple simultaneous shocks. But there is another factor. A new metal was spreading through the Eastern Mediterranean at exactly this moment, carried by traders and migrants and the movement of peoples that the collapse itself was generating. Iron. Iron ore is dramatically more common than copper or tin. It exists in accessible deposits on every continent, in quantities that dwarf the relatively rare deposits of the metals needed for bronze. A society that can work iron is not dependent on the long-distance trade networks that brought tin from Britain or Afghanistan to the bronze smiths of the Mediterranean. It can arm its soldiers from local resources. It can produce weapons in quantities that the supply-constrained bronze industry could never match. The catch is that iron is harder to work than bronze. It requires higher temperatures, temperatures that the furnace technology of the early Bronze Age could not achieve. And iron, at the temperatures available to early smiths, is not better than bronze. It is actually softer, less able to hold an edge, less suitable for weapons. What changed everything was the discovery of steel. Not steel as we understand it today, the precisely engineered alloys of the modern metallurgical industry. Early steel, produced by heating iron in contact with carbon, which allowed carbon atoms to migrate into the iron crystal structure and dramatically increase its hardness. The process was poorly understood by the people who discovered it. It was more craft knowledge than scientific understanding, passed from smith to apprentice through generations of practice, varying in quality from the barely adequate to the extraordinary. The swords produced by the best early ironsmiths were better than bronze, not in every property. Bronze resists corrosion better and was in some ways easier to work, but in the properties that mattered most for weapons. Hardness, the ability to hold a sharp edge through heavy use, resilience under impact, and, critically, the ability to be produced in much larger quantities from much more widely available raw materials. Iron democratized weapons in the way that 2,500 years later, the gun would democratize them again. When iron weapons are available to anyone who lives near an iron deposit, the military advantage that bronze gave to the wealthy and well-connected states that controlled the tin trade disappears. New powers can rise. Old powers, whose advantage was built on control of Bronze Age supply chains, find that advantage suddenly irrelevant. The political map redraws itself. The Iron Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse was not just a period of different weapons, it was a period of different political possibilities. Smaller and more peripheral peoples could now arm themselves effectively. The great palace economies that had dominated the Bronze Age were replaced by a more diverse and more competitive political landscape. City-states and tribal confederacies, and new kingdoms rising in the spaces left by the collapsed empires. The Assyrians built the most formidable army the ancient world had yet seen, combining iron weapons with a tactical and logistical sophistication that allowed them to project military force across the entire Middle East. The Greeks developed the phalanx, a formation of iron spear-carrying soldiers moving in disciplined coordination that proved devastatingly effective against the cavalry and chariot armies of the Persian Empire. The Romans, who would eventually build the most successful military machine in ancient history, began their rise in the Iron Age, equipping their legions with iron swords and iron discipline and iron organization. Iron lasted, not forever, nothing lasts forever, but the metallurgical tradition that began with the first ironsmiths heating ore in charcoal fires and learning by trial and error how to control the carbon content of their product, continued without interruption into the medieval period and beyond, growing in sophistication and understanding until it produced the steel that built the industrial world. Every steel beam in every building, in every city on Earth, is the descendant of the first iron weapon. The sword became the skeleton of civilization. China invented gunpowder by accident, while trying to make an immortality elixir. This is not a metaphor. Taoist alchemists in the 9th century CE were conducting systematic experiments with combinations of natural substances in search of the elixir of life, the substance that would allow a human being to transcend death and achieve immortality. They were mixing sulfur and charcoal and saltpeter, potassium nitrate, which they had been using separately for medicinal purposes, and at some point during these experiments, someone combined the three in roughly the right proportions and applied heat. The explosion that resulted was not what they were looking for, but they noticed what they had found. The earliest written reference to gunpowder in the historical record appears in a Chinese military manual from 850 CE, which describes a mixture of sulfur, charcoal and saltpeter that burns with great violence and warns military engineers to be careful when preparing it because several people had already been killed by premature ignitions. Within a century of its discovery, gunpowder had migrated from the alchemical laboratory to the battlefield, and Chinese military engineers were experimenting with it in ways that would eventually reshape the entire nature of warfare. The first gunpowder weapons were not guns. They were fire weapons. Incendiary devices that used the rapid combustion of gunpowder to project burning material at an enemy, to set fire to ships and fortifications, and the tightly packed formations of soldiers that medieval armies used. Fire arrows tipped with gunpowder-soaked material. Bombs made from ceramic containers packed with gunpowder and shrapnel, thrown by hand or launched from catapults. Fire lances, bamboo tubes packed with gunpowder that produced a brief but violent jet of flame when ignited, the ancestors of the flamethrower. These were formidable weapons, but they were not yet guns. The conceptual leap from a tube that produced fire to a tube that used the expanding gas of a gunpowder explosion to propel a projectile was not obvious. It required understanding that the explosive force of gunpowder could be directed, that a sealed tube open at one end would channel the explosion in a specific direction, with enough force to accelerate a projectile to lethal velocity. The first true guns appeared in China sometime in the 12th or 13th century. Metal or bamboo tubes loaded with gunpowder and a projectile, the projectile being driven out of the tube by the expanding gases of the burning powder. They were crude, inaccurate, slow to load, dangerous to the people firing them as well as those being fired at, because early metallurgy was not reliable enough to guarantee that the tube would contain the explosion rather than fragmenting under the pressure. But they worked. Gunpowder reached the Islamic world through the trade routes of Central Asia sometime in the 13th century, and it reached Europe shortly after, carried by traders and travelers and the movement of peoples generated by the Mongol conquests that was simultaneously reshaping the political geography of Eurasia. By the early 14th century, Europeans were making guns. By the late 14th century, they were making cannon. And by the middle of the 15th century, cannon had made something happen that changed the entire political structure of medieval Europe. They destroyed the castle. The medieval castle was not just a military installation, it was a political institution. The entire feudal system, the arrangement by which a small class of mounted warriors dominated the agricultural populations of medieval Europe, rested on the military superiority that the castle represented. A stone castle, properly supplied and properly defended, could hold against any force that could be assembled in the medieval world. Siege warfare before cannon was an exercise in patience, surrounding the castle and waiting for the defenders to starve, a process that could take months or years, and that often failed because a relieving army arrived before the garrison ran out of food. Cannon made this calculus obsolete. The cannon that the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II brought to the walls of Constantinople in 1453 were the largest ever built to that point. Cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had offered his services first to the Byzantine emperor and being turned down because the emperor could not afford his fee, then to Mehmed, who could. The largest of Urban's cannon was so big it required 60 oxen and 400 men to move it, and it could only be fired 7 times a day because it needed to cool between shots. It was enough. The walls of Constantinople had stood for 1,000 years. They had been built by the Emperor Theodosius in the 5th century CE and had never been successfully breached by any enemy. They were the finest fortifications in the medieval world. Double walls with a moat, towers at regular intervals, designed by engineers who understood defensive architecture with a sophistication unmatched in their era. Urban's cannon reduced sections of those walls to rubble in weeks. On May 29, 1453, Ottoman forces poured through the breaches, and Constantinople fell. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine state that had survived the fall of the Western Empire by nearly 1,000 years, ended. The largest and most sophisticated city in the Christian world became the capital of an Islamic empire. A cannon did it. The news traveled through Europe with the speed of catastrophe, and the political and military establishment of the continent drew the obvious conclusion simultaneously. Castles were obsolete. The stone walls that had protected the feudal aristocracy for 5 centuries could be knocked down by artillery that was becoming cheaper and more mobile with every decade that passed. The military advantage that had justified the feudal system, the castle-holding knight who could dominate the surrounding countryside from his impregnable fortification, was gone. What replaced it was the state. Only a centralized state with the tax revenues of an entire kingdom could afford the artillery train that the new warfare required. Dozens of cannon, hundreds of horses to move them, thousands of skilled artillerists and engineers to operate and maintain them. The vast logistical apparatus of supply and transport that sustained them in the field. No individual feudal lord could sustain this. Only kings could. The cannon killed the castle, and the castle's death killed feudalism. The centralized nation-state, with its professional army and its bureaucratic administration and its monopoly on legitimate violence, was built on the ruins of the feudal order that cannon had destroyed. Meanwhile, the gun itself, the handheld firearm that an individual soldier could carry and operate, was developing along a parallel track that would prove equally consequential. The earliest handheld firearms, the hand cannons of the 14th century, were essentially miniature cannon, metal tubes held in the hands or braced against the body and fired by applying a burning match to a touch hole. They were inaccurate, slow to load, and unreliable, misfiring frequently and occasionally exploding. An experienced crossbowman could shoot several bolts in the time it took a hand cannon operator to reload and fire once. And the crossbow bolt was more accurate at any practical combat range. But guns improved. The matchlock mechanism, developed in the early 15th century, used a spring-loaded arm holding a lit match to ignite the powder automatically when the trigger was pulled, freeing the shooter's hands and dramatically improving accuracy. The wheel lock, developed around 1500, used a spinning steel wheel to create sparks, eliminating the need for a constantly burning match. The flintlock, which appeared in the early 17th century and remained the dominant mechanism for 200 years, used a flint striking steel to create reliable ignition in a mechanism that was simpler, cheaper, and more weatherproof than anything that had come before. With the flintlock, the gun became practical. Practical enough to equip entire armies, practical enough to replace the pike and the crossbow and the bow as the primary weapon of the infantry soldier. Practical enough to put in the hands of men who had received weeks of training rather than the years of practice that a skilled archer required. This last point was critical. The English longbow that had devastated French cavalry at Agincourt in 1415 was a weapon of extraordinary power and range. A skilled longbowman could shoot 12 aimed arrows per minute with enough force to penetrate armor at 200 meters. But training a longbowman took years, beginning in childhood, developing the unusual musculature required to draw a war bow hundreds of times a day. The skeletal remains of medieval English archers are identifiable by the deformities their training produced. Enlarged left arms, asymmetric shoulder development, spinal curvature from years of drawing heavy bows. A musketeer with a flintlock could be trained in weeks. The gun democratized the soldier the way it democratized killing. It made military power available to states that could conscript and briefly train large numbers of ordinary men, replacing the small armies of highly skilled professional warriors that the pre-gunpowder era had required. Armies grew. Wars became more destructive. The casualties of the gunpowder era dwarfed anything that had come before. And somewhere in the workshops of Europe, in the same period that the flintlock was reaching its mature form, engineers were thinking about the problem that had constrained gun technology since its beginning. The gun could only fire once before it needed to be reloaded. What if it could fire more? The Industrial Revolution did not just make weapons cheaper, it made them different in kind. Before industrialization, a gun was a handmade object. Each one produced by a skilled craftsman who filed and fitted and adjusted individual components until they worked together with sufficient reliability. No two guns were exactly alike. The parts of one musket would not necessarily fit another musket of the same model, because each component had been made by hand to slightly different dimensions. If a part broke in the field, it had to be custom fitted by a gunsmith. An army's weapons were, in a meaningful sense, a collection of unique objects rather than a standardized system. This changed in the early 19th century with a concept so simple and so consequential that it is now the invisible foundation of every manufactured object in the world. Interchangeable parts. The idea that every component of a manufactured object should be made to such precise and consistent dimensions that any example of that component would fit any example of the object without filing or fitting or adjustment. That a trigger spring from one rifle would drop directly into any other rifle of the same model. That parts could be mass-produced by unskilled workers operating machines rather than crafted by skilled artisans working by hand. The American inventor Eli Whitney, better known for the cotton gin, demonstrated the concept to the United States government in 1801 by disassembling 10 muskets, mixing up their components and reassembling them into 10 working muskets from randomly selected parts. The demonstration was partly theatre. The muskets had been carefully pre-selected, and the parts were not quite as interchangeable as Whitney claimed. But the principle it illustrated was real, and its military implications were immediately understood. An army with interchangeable parts could be resupplied and repaired in the field without skilled craftsmen. Damaged weapons could be fixed by swapping components rather than by returning them to a workshop. The entire logistics of military supply simplified dramatically when every rifle in the army was genuinely identical to every other rifle. The Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and the Harper's Ferry Armory in Virginia became the laboratories of this new manufacturing philosophy, developing the machine tools and the gauging systems and the manufacturing processes that made true interchangeability possible. The system they developed, called the American System of Manufacturing, spread from weapons production to every other manufactured product and became the foundation of the industrial economy that transformed the world in the 19th century. The gun industry invented mass production, and mass production made the next generation of guns possible. The problem that had constrained firearms since their invention was the muzzle loading process. To fire a muzzle-loading gun, a soldier had to pour a measured charge of powder down the barrel, follow it with a ball or bullet, ram both down with a ramrod to seat them properly against the breech, prime the firing mechanism, and then fire. Under ideal conditions, with a trained soldier moving as fast as possible, this process took approximately 30 seconds. In combat conditions, with shaking hands and enemy fire, and the physical and psychological stress of battle, it took longer. 30 seconds between shots. Every advance in firearms technology from the 16th century to the mid-19th was aimed at reducing this interval. The flintlock had improved ignition reliability. The rifle, which added spiral grooves to the barrel to spin the bullet and dramatically improved accuracy, had been resisted by military establishments for decades because the tight fit required for the rifling to work made loading even slower than a smooth-bore musket. The solution came from two directions simultaneously. The first was the metallic cartridge. The idea of combining the powder charge and the bullet in a single waterproof metal case that could be loaded from the breech of the gun rather than the muzzle had been developing through the early 19th century in various incomplete forms. The rimfire cartridge, developed in the 1840s, put a priming compound in the rim of a brass case and combined it with the powder charge and bullet in a single unit that could be loaded instantly. The centerfire cartridge, which placed the primer in the center of the base and proved more reliable and more adaptable to large calibers, followed in the 1860s. The metallic cartridge made breech loading practical.
The second development was the repeating action, the mechanism that allowed a gun to chamber a new cartridge and cock the firing mechanism automatically as part of a simple manual operation, allowing a shooter to fire multiple times without removing the gun from the shoulder or performing any complex loading procedure. The Henry rifle, introduced in 1860, combined a metallic rimfire cartridge with a lever-action repeating mechanism that allowed a shooter to fire 16 shots in approximately 10 seconds. 16 shots in 10 seconds. A soldier armed with a Henry rifle had a rate of fire roughly 100 times greater than a soldier armed with the standard military musket of 20 years earlier. When Confederate soldiers encountered Union troops armed with Henry rifles during the Civil War, they called it "that damned Yankee rifle that you could load on Sunday and shoot all week." It was not quite an exaggeration. The Civil War was the first industrial war, the first conflict in which the productive capacity of an industrial economy was directly applied to the problem of killing on a massive scale, in which factories running around the clock produced weapons and ammunition in quantities that no previous war had required or could have supplied. The Union's industrial advantage over the Confederate States, which had a largely agricultural economy with limited manufacturing capacity, was as decisive as any tactical or strategic factor in the outcome. But the Civil War was also a preview of something that the military establishments of Europe, watching carefully from across the Atlantic, did not fully understand until they experienced it themselves. Industrial weapons applied to massed infantry tactics produced casualties on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. The tactical doctrines of the Civil War era were inherited from the Napoleonic period, designed for the smoothbore musket with its effective range of perhaps 100 meters and its 30-second reload time. At those ranges and with that rate of fire, a disciplined infantry advance could cross the killing ground before the defenders could reload more than once or twice. The mathematical relationship between the advancing force and the defending fire was manageable. The rifle changed the mathematics catastrophically. An accurate rifled musket could kill at 400 meters. A repeating rifle could fire 16 shots in 10 seconds. An advancing infantry formation, moving at the pace of a walk, covered perhaps 50 meters per minute. The arithmetic is brutal. A line of defenders with repeating rifles could fire dozens of rounds into an advancing formation before it closed to within effective range of the bayonet, the weapon that Napoleonic tactics had been designed to deliver to the enemy line. The result was the slaughter that defined the Civil War. Gettysburg, Cold Harbor, the siege of Petersburg. Attacks that sent men forward in disciplined formations into fields of fire that no human body could survive in sufficient numbers to carry the objective. Casualty rates that would have been recognized as catastrophic by any previous generation of military commanders, but that became, in the Industrial War, simply the cost of doing business. The lesson was written in 250,000 American graves. The European military establishments noted the lesson, and then, 20 years later, forgot it. Because in 1884, in a workshop in London, an American-born inventor named Hiram Maxim asked himself a question that nobody had asked quite so directly before. Why does the shooter have to do the work of reloading?
The firing of a gun produces energy. The expanding gases that propel the bullet also push backward against the mechanism of the gun with considerable force. The recoil that every shooter feels against their shoulder. This energy was being wasted, absorbed by the shooter's body and dissipated as heat and motion. Maxim realized that this energy could be captured and used to operate the loading mechanism automatically, extracting the spent cartridge and chambering a new one and cocking the firing mechanism in the fraction of a second between shots. The Maxim gun, which he demonstrated in 1884, fired 600 rounds per minute. 600 rounds per minute. A single soldier operating a Maxim gun had a rate of fire equivalent to approximately 100 soldiers with bolt-action rifles. It required only water to cool the barrel and ammunition to feed it, both of which could be supplied in essentially unlimited quantities by industrial production. Winston Churchill, who as a young cavalry officer charged at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898 against Sudanese forces who had no Maxim guns, while the British forces did, described the battle with a clarity that cuts through any romanticism about the era of imperial warfare. The Sudanese forces were brave. They charged directly into Maxim gunfire with a courage that Churchill acknowledged unreservedly. It made no difference. The Maxim gun killed 11,000 of them in 5 hours. The British lost 47 men. This was the future of warfare. Not courage against courage, skill against skill. The individual human qualities that military tradition had always celebrated as the determinants of battle. But industrial production against human bodies. The factory against the soldier. The European powers that had been watching and noting and building their own versions of the Maxim gun and the magazine rifle and the quick-firing artillery that the same industrial revolution had produced, went to war with each other in August 1914. They had forgotten the lesson of the Civil War. They remembered it very quickly. At the Somme, on July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered 57,000 casualties in a single day. The largest single-day loss in the history of the British military, before or since. Men who had walked forward in disciplined lines across no man's land toward German positions protected by barbed wire and defended by Maxim guns. Industrial weapons, industrial casualties. The machine gun did not win the First World War. No single weapon wins wars. But the machine gun, combined with barbed wire and artillery and the industrial capacity to produce all of them in unlimited quantities, created the conditions of the Western Front. The 4 years of stalemate and slaughter that killed 17 million people and permanently altered the political and psychological landscape of the Western world. The question that the generals of 1914 could not answer, the question of how to move forward across ground defended by machine guns, drove the development of the weapons that would define the next war. Tanks, aircraft, and eventually, something that made the machine gun look like a primitive tool. The weapon that ended all argument about what weapons could do. On the morning of August 6th, 1945, a single aircraft flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Not a formation, not the hundreds of bombers that had been incinerating Japanese cities one by one through the spring and summer of 1945, dropping conventional explosives and incendiary bombs that burned wooden buildings with a thoroughness that killed more people per raid than most battles in human history. A single B-29, flying at 30,000 feet, too high for the anti-aircraft guns that had been defending Japanese cities all year. The people of Hiroshima looked up and saw it, and did not take cover. One plane was not a raid. One plane was a reconnaissance flight, or a weather observation, or something else that did not require the disruption of the morning routine. The city of 350,000 people went about its business. People walked to work and opened shops and ate breakfast and sent children to school and did the 1,000 ordinary things that ordinary mornings require. At 8:15 a.m., the aircraft released a single bomb. 43 seconds later, at an altitude of approximately 600 meters above the city, the bomb detonated. Everything within 2 kilometers of the detonation point was destroyed instantly. Not damaged, not set on fire, destroyed. The buildings and the infrastructure and the people within them by a blast wave and a heat pulse of a magnitude that had never before been produced by any human action. The temperature at the center of the explosion reached several million degrees, briefly hotter than the surface of the sun. 70,000 people died in the first seconds. Another 70,000 would die in the following months from burns and blast injuries and radiation sickness. A new category of weapon-caused death that medicine had no framework for treating, because nothing like it had ever existed before. One bomb, one aircraft, one city. The entire destructive capacity of the conventional bombing campaigns that had been running for years, requiring thousands of aircraft and hundreds of thousands of bombs, and the industrial output of entire nations, had been compressed into a single device that weighed 4,000 kilograms and could be carried by a single plane. This was not an improvement in weapons technology. It was a discontinuity, a break in the logic that had governed weapons development since the first stone was picked up on the African savanna. Every previous advance had made weapons more lethal, more accurate, more reliable, faster to operate. The atomic bomb was all of those things and something else entirely. Something that previous weapons had not been. It was a civilization-ending weapon, not in metaphor, in engineering specification. The scientists who designed it understood, and the military planners who deployed it understood, and the political leaders who authorized it understood, that a sufficient number of these weapons used against a sufficient number of targets would not just defeat an enemy, it would end the civilization of the enemy. Possibly end civilization itself, if enough of them were used in enough places. The history of how this weapon came to exist is a story within a story, a compressed drama of scientific discovery and political urgency and moral compromise that unfolded over 6 years and involved the most concentrated gathering of scientific talent in history. It begins in December 1938 in a laboratory in Berlin. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, chemists working on the properties of uranium, bombarded uranium atoms with neutrons and found in the products of the reaction traces of barium. Barium is roughly half the atomic weight of uranium. The only way barium could appear in a uranium bombardment experiment was if the uranium nucleus had split, had fissioned. had divided into two smaller nuclei, releasing in the process an amount of energy consistent with Einstein's equation relating mass and energy. An equation that had been sitting in theoretical physics for 30 years, without anyone quite believing that it had practical applications. The uranium nucleus had split, and splitting it released energy. Lisa Meitner, an Austrian Jewish physicist who had been forced to flee Germany when the Nazis came to power, and who received Hahn's experimental results by letter while hiding in Sweden, did the calculation on a piece of paper sitting on a log in a snowy forest. The energy released by the fission of a single uranium nucleus was 200 million electron volts. The energy released by a conventional chemical explosion involved rearrangements of electrons in the outer shells of atoms, releasing energies measured in single-digit electron volts per reaction. 200 million versus a few. The difference between a conventional bomb and an atomic bomb is the difference between the energy of chemical bonds and the energy of nuclear forces. It is not a quantitative difference. It is a difference in the fundamental physics of where the energy comes from. Meitner understood immediately what this meant. So did every physicist who heard about Hahn's results in the weeks that followed, as the news spread through the international community of nuclear physicists with a speed that the political situation of early 1939 made terrifying rather than exciting. Because in early 1939, Adolf Hitler controlled Germany, and Germany had uranium. The physicists who understood fission also understood that a chain reaction in which each fission event released neutrons that triggered further fission events could, in principle, release energy not in single nuclear reactions, but in a cascade of billions of reactions occurring in microseconds. The energy released would be enormous. The explosion produced would be of a scale qualitatively beyond anything that conventional chemistry could produce. They understood this, and they understood that German physicists, some of the best in the world, understood it too. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jewish physicist who had fled Europe and was working in the United States, drafted a letter and brought it to the most famous physicist in the world to sign. He understood that a letter from an unknown Hungarian refugee would not reach the President of the United States. A letter from Albert Einstein would. Einstein signed. Franklin Roosevelt received the letter in October 1939 and authorized a preliminary research program. After Pearl Harbor and the American entry into the war, that preliminary program became the Manhattan Project, the largest and most expensive scientific and engineering undertaking in human history to that point. $2 billion, 130,000 people. Facilities spread across the United States and Canada, from a football stadium in Chicago, where the first nuclear reactor achieved criticality in December 1942, to the enrichment plants at Oak Ridge in Tennessee, to the plutonium production reactors at Hanford in Washington, to the Bond Design Laboratory at Los Alamos in New Mexico, where Robert Oppenheimer assembled the physicists who would turn the theoretical possibility of nuclear fission into an actual weapon. The men and women of Los Alamos were extraordinary, not just in intelligence, though the concentration of Nobel Prize winners and future Nobel Prize winners in that remote New Mexico mesa was without precedent. but in the particular moral complexity of what they were doing, which most of them understood with uncomfortable clarity. They were building a weapon of mass destruction. Some of them had begun the project because they feared Germany would build it first, and a Nazi atomic bomb was a possibility too terrible to allow by inaction. Germany's nuclear program, they discovered after the war, had never come close to success. Hampered by the loss of its best Jewish physicists to emigration, and by strategic decisions that redirected resources away from nuclear research. The fear that had driven the Manhattan Project was real, but the threat had been less advanced than anyone knew. By the time the bomb was ready, Germany had surrendered. The bomb that had been conceived as a counter to Nazi Germany was now aimed at Japan. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the first atomic bomb was detonated. The test was called Trinity. Oppenheimer, watching the fireball rise above the desert, recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." 22 days later, the bomb, called Little Boy, fell on Hiroshima. 3 days after that, a second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The Second World War ended, and the world that emerged from it was fundamentally different from any world that had existed before, because it contained a weapon that made the logic of warfare itself uncertain in a new and paralyzing way. The logic of warfare, the logic that had driven weapons development from the first stone spear to the machine gun, was that weapons existed to be used. You built them, you trained with them, you deployed them, and you used them to defeat your enemy. The utility of a weapon was in its use. A weapon that was never used was a failure, a resource wasted, a deterrent that had not deterred. Nuclear weapons broke this logic. A nuclear weapon used against an enemy with nuclear weapons of their own guaranteed retaliation. Retaliation guaranteed escalation. Escalation guaranteed a nuclear exchange. A nuclear exchange between major powers, as became clear within a decade of Hiroshima as the Soviet Union developed its own bomb, and both superpowers built arsenals of thousands of weapons, would not produce a winner. It would produce a wasteland. The military strategists and the game theorists and the political scientists who spent the Cold War thinking about nuclear weapons developed a doctrine they called mutually assured destruction. The acronym was MAD, which everyone recognized as appropriate. The doctrine held that nuclear weapons were useful precisely because they could not be used, that the certainty of mutual destruction deterred both sides from initiating a nuclear exchange, creating a stability built not on peace, but on the shared understanding that war between nuclear powers meant the end of both. It was the most terrifying peace in human history. And it held, not because the people controlling the weapons were always rational, or always well-informed, or always free from the pressures and miscalculations that had started every previous war. There were moments,
The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 being the most widely known, but not the only one, when the machinery of nuclear deterrence came close to failing, when misunderstandings and miscommunications and the simple fog of crisis brought the world to the edge of a nuclear exchange, that the doctrine of mutually assured destruction was supposed to make impossible. It held because of luck as much as because of strategy, because individual human beings, in moments of extreme pressure, made decisions to de-escalate rather than escalate, because the systems designed to prevent accidental launches mostly worked, because the doctrine, for all its terrifying logic, created enough hesitation in enough decision-makers enough of the time to prevent the catastrophe it was designed to prevent. The atomic bomb changed war by making the largest possible war unthinkable. And in making the largest war unthinkable, it pushed violence into smaller spaces. Proxy wars fought by the superpowers through client states, insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, terrorism.
The entire landscape of post-1945 conflict was shaped by the existence of nuclear weapons, which ruled out direct confrontation between the major powers and channeled their competition into every other available form. The weapon that ended the Second World War also ended the era in which great powers could fight each other directly. It did not end war. Nothing has ended war. But it changed war in ways that are still working themselves out, in the conflicts of the present and the weapons being developed for the future. In the laboratories and the strategy documents and the arms control negotiations that are the unglamorous daily business of living in a world that contains thousands of nuclear warheads and no reliable mechanism for getting rid of them. Oppenheimer watched the fireball rise over the New Mexico desert and thought of the destroyer of worlds. The world was not destroyed, but it was changed, permanently and irrevocably, in ways that the man who said those words understood better than almost anyone else alive. The destroyer of worlds created the world we live in. We are still living in it. There is a drone circling over a city right now. Not a metaphor, not a hypothetical. At this exact moment, somewhere in the world, an unmanned aircraft is flying a surveillance or strike pattern over a populated area, operated by a person sitting in a climate-controlled room on the other side of the planet, watching a live video feed on a screen, making decisions about what they are seeing with the same cognitive apparatus that a human being uses to decide anything. The drone is the logical endpoint of the trajectory that began with the spear. Reach, force, safety. The spear gave reach beyond the arm. The bow gave reach beyond the spear. The gun gave reach beyond the bow. The artillery shell gave reach beyond the gun. The missile gave reach beyond the artillery. The drone gives reach beyond all of them, eliminating the last remaining physical constraint on the application of lethal force from a distance. The person operating the drone is in no danger. The person the drone is watching may not know they are being watched.
This asymmetry, the complete separation of the person applying violence from any personal risk of violence in return, is the culmination of 500,000 years of weapons development. Every step on that long path was in the direction of this moment. More reach, more force, more safety for the wielder. The drone is not a new direction. It is the arrival at a destination that was implicit in the first thrown stone. But it is also something new, because the drone can be made autonomous. Not operated by a human being sitting in Nevada watching a screen, operated by an algorithm, making targeting decisions based on pattern recognition and machine learning and the statistical analysis of sensor data, without a human being in the decision loop at the moment of the kill. The autonomous weapon, the machine that decides who dies. This technology exists.
Not in the science fiction sense of a future possibility, but in the engineering sense of a present reality. The components necessary to build a weapon that can identify a target and engage it without human authorization are available today. The artificial intelligence capable of making targeting decisions with a reliability that its developers claim exceeds human performance under combat stress is being developed and tested and deployed in various forms by multiple militaries simultaneously. The question of whether to build these weapons is no longer theoretical. The question is whether to constrain them. Whether the international community can agree on rules governing autonomous weapons before they are deployed at scale, the way it agreed on rules governing chemical weapons and biological weapons, and, partially and imperfectly, nuclear weapons. Whether the logic that has governed every previous arms control negotiation, the logic that says weapons exist to be used and the question is only under what constraints, can be applied to weapons that make their own decisions. The campaign to stop killer robots, a coalition of non-governmental organizations that has been lobbying the United Nations since 2013, argues that autonomous weapons cross a moral threshold that no previous weapon has crossed. That the decision to take a human life must always be made by a human being, who can be held accountable for that decision. That delegating the kill decision to an algorithm is not a technical question, but an ethical one, and that the answer to the ethical question must precede the technical deployment. The militaries developing autonomous weapons argue that they will be more precise than human soldiers, less subject to the panic and rage and tribalism that cause human combatants to commit atrocities. That an algorithm does not massacre civilians in revenge for the deaths of comrades. That an autonomous weapon, properly programmed, will follow the laws of war more reliably than the human beings who have always violated them. Both arguments contain truth. Neither resolves the question. Because the question underneath the question that autonomous weapons force into the open in a way that previous weapons did not, is the question of what violence is for, what purpose it serves.
whether the removal of human beings from the act of killing changes the nature of the act, and if so, how, and whether the change is towards something better or something worse. This question has been present in the history of weapons from the beginning. Every increase in the distance between the person killing and the person dying has raised it in some form. The archer who kills from 100 meters does not feel the death the way the soldier who kills with a sword does. The artillery crew that fires shells at targets they cannot see does not experience the killing the way the archer does. The drone operator who watches a target die on a screen in Nevada and then drives home for dinner is at a distance from the act that is qualitatively different from any previous form of combat. What happens when the human being is removed entirely? The military theorists and the ethicists and the lawyers who specialize in the laws of armed conflict are working on this question with an urgency that reflects how close the technology is. But the weapons developers are working faster than the theorists. They always have. The history of weapons is a history of technology outrunning the ethical and political frameworks designed to govern it, of weapons appearing in the world before the world has decided how to think about them. The atomic bomb appeared before the world had decided whether nuclear deterrence was a stable foundation for international security. It turned out to be stable enough, barely, through decades of Cold War. Whether it will remain stable as more countries acquire nuclear weapons and the arms control architecture built in the Cold War continues to erode is a question that has no reassuring answer. The cyber weapon is another form of this problem. Stuxnet, the malicious software developed jointly by the United States and Israel and deployed against Iranian nuclear centrifuges around 2010, was the first weapon in history made entirely of code. It crossed international borders without a physical presence. It entered a computer system that was not connected to the internet through infected USB drives carried by people who did not know what they were carrying. It destroyed physical machinery, the centrifuges, by sending them commands that caused them to tear themselves apart while reporting to their operators that everything was normal. It was the first act of warfare in which the weapon was invisible, the attack was deniable, and the damage was physical, but the means were entirely digital. Stuxnet was discovered and analyzed, and its code was published, which meant that every sophisticated state actor and many non-state actors could study exactly how it worked and learn from it. The weapon that was meant to set back the Iranian nuclear program by destroying centrifuges also educated every potential adversary about how to build similar weapons. This is another recurring pattern in the history of weapons. The weapon that gives one side an advantage is always eventually understood and replicated by the other side. The bronze sword spreads from its point of origin because the advantage it gives is too obvious for neighboring peoples to ignore. The gun spreads from China across Eurasia because every state that encounters it either adopts it or is conquered by states that have. The nuclear bomb spreads because the Soviet Union, watching Hiroshima, understood immediately that it needed one
and devoted the resources of an entire command economy to getting it. Cyber weapons are spreading the same way. Every major military power is developing offensive cyber capabilities. The infrastructure of the modern world, the power grids and the water systems and the financial networks and the communication systems, is run by computers that are connected to networks that can be penetrated by sufficiently sophisticated attackers. The vulnerability is universal, and the attackers are multiplying. A cyber attack on a power grid in winter kills people as surely as a bomb does. More slowly, through cold and the failure of hospitals and the disruption of supply chains, but just as dead. The weapon made of code can produce casualties that the laws of armed conflict were not designed to address, delivered through means that the concept of warfare was not designed to encompass. And underneath all of this, underneath the drones and the autonomous systems and the cyber weapons and the hypersonic missiles and the directed energy weapons and all the other developments that are reshaping the nature of conflict in the 21st century, the oldest dynamic in the history of weapons continues to operate with the same remorseless logic it has always had. The group with the better weapons wins. Or at least, the group with the better weapons does not lose to the group with worse ones. Which is why every state that can afford to develop better weapons does. Why the defense budgets of the major powers continue to grow even in periods of nominal peace. Why the arms race that everyone agrees is dangerous and expensive and potentially catastrophic continues nonetheless, driven by the same logic that drove the first human being to pick up a rock and understand that it was better to have the rock than not to have it. The spear tip in the South African Museum is 500,000 years old. The drone circling over the city is 500,000 years newer. The logic connecting them has not changed. What has changed is the scale. The first spear tip could kill one person. The atomic bomb could kill a city. The full exchange of the nuclear arsenals that exist today could kill most of the human beings on Earth and render the planet uninhabitable for the survivors. The reach has extended to the horizon. The force has grown to the point where it threatens the species that developed it. The safety of the wielder has been maximized to the point where the person applying violence risks nothing at all. 500,000 years of weapons development, 500,000 years of human ingenuity applied to the problem of killing more effectively. And the end point of that trajectory, the logical conclusion of the line that runs from the stone spear to the autonomous drone to the nuclear warhead, is a weapon that could end the story entirely. Not just the story of weapons, the story of the beings who made them. The stone point in the museum case catches the light in the way that stone catches light, dully, without the flash of metal, without the gleam of anything refined. It is rough, and it is old, and it is made of the same material that was lying on the ground before the being who shaped it existed. Someone picked it up,
Someone looked at it and understood what it could become. Someone made it into something that could kill. That someone is us. Across every iteration, across every century and every civilization, and every advance in the technology of violence, the being holding the weapon is always us. Always the same species that looked at a rock and imagined a spear, and then looked at a spear and imagined a bow, and then looked at a bow and imagined a gun, and then looked at a gun and imagined a bomb, and then looked at a bomb and imagined something that has not yet been built, but will be, because the imagination that looks at what exists and sees what could exist has never stopped. It is the same imagination that built the cathedrals and wrote the symphonies and mapped the genome and sent the telescope to the edge of the observable universe. The same mind, the same species. The question that the history of weapons leaves open, the question that 500,000 years of evidence has not resolved, is whether the imagination that has always found a way to build the next weapon will also find a way to decide not to use it. We have come very close. We are still here. For now, that is enough. Sleep well, if you can.